Professor Wisse is, without question, the greatest scholar of modern Jewish literature of her generation. She was one of the founding figures of the entire field of academic Jewish studies in North America, and she was an intellectual force of nature at Harvard University for more than 2 decades. For this alone, she would be worthy of praise and wonder. But what makes Ruth Wisse a Jewish leader and an inspiration to future Jewish leaders is not simply her penetrating mind, but her unwavering moral courage. Like Norman Podhoretz, her brilliant and beloved editor for many years, whom we will honor later today, Professor Wisse faces up to the truths of history when too many Jews still seek to avert their eyes. She is the master diagnostician of Jewish politics, a voice of Jewish memory and Jewish conscience, and she does it all with charm, humility, and the full arsenal of Jewish civilization at her fingertips. It is my great honor and privilege to introduce the distinguished Tikva Senior Fellow, our teacher, Ruth Wisse.
May I also say, though, to start, that my brilliant editor is Neil Kozadoy, as well as Norman Podhoretz. And I would like to say that I come here as somebody in attendance with my husband and my daughter. Like all of you, I'm not just a speaker, but I've been looking forward to this day. So I really thank those who have organized it. This is a wonderful occasion for me. And now for something very jolly, an autopsy for Jewish socialism. By saying this, I confirm that there has been a death in the family, and I set out to investigate why the merger of the words Jewish and socialism did not survive. Some of you may say, like Mark Twain, how strange that we should be quoting this rabbi twice. Reading his premature obituary said, "Reports of my death are greatly exaggerated." After all, we can say, the Jewish socialists may say, that a Jew is now seeking the presidency of the United States as a socialist. And in the Jewish Week, very recently, a young Jew who claimed to speak for his generation hailed Bernie Sanders not only as the best of the Jewish past, and I quote, but as American Jewry's future. Well, I say otherwise. Jews once tried to secure the Jewish people through a merger with socialism and learned at great cost that they could not. Today, socialism is undertaken by Jews in defense of Israel's enemies, and it is murderous by definition, and I'll try to explain. The question of Jews and socialism actually popped up for me unexpectedly in the mid-1960s during a checkup with a Jewish family doctor who was usually strictly professional. This time, he seemed so agitated that I turned the tables to ask if there was anything wrong with him. And he said his daughter had just let them know that she intended to marry a non-Jew, something that was still very rare in Montreal half a century ago. And he said, "The worst of it is I have no one to blame but myself." I sent her to the Peretz-Schule, and there, right in the lobby of the school, was their credo. Alle Menschen seien Brüder, Bräune, Gelbe, Schwarze, Weiße, Völker, Rassen und Klimaten, sie sind ausgetrachte Meise. So if I sent her to that school, what did I expect? Now, surprised as I was to hear this man singing Yiddish verse, I was more shocked by what he was saying. The Peretz-Schule was a Jewish elementary school associated with Jewish socialism and named for the great Yiddish writer Yitzhak Leib Peretz. The doctor was quoting from a Peretz poem called Brothers, Brüder. All people are brothers, yellow, brown, black, white. Their division into nations, races, and climates, that's just a made-up story. This was Peretz's free adaptation of Friedrich Schiller's Ode to Joy, best known as the chorale finale of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony and a staple of Yiddish choirs. Who could possibly find anything wrong with a fervent declaration of international brotherhood? Well, the Jewish parent whose child had acted on those words. That's who. The doctor was saying that the message of socialist internationalism had doomed his child to stop thinking of herself as a Jew. He blamed her intermarriage on Peretz, the school, and himself for having ignored their implications. Now, I didn't think this was quite fair. Peretz wrote the poem in 1892 when he was living in Warsaw, overwhelmed by the hardship and misery of its 300,000 Jews, a third of the city. The Jewish community could not cope with the expanding crisis of urban crowding, infant mortality, rampant disease, the awful working conditions of those who had employment, and the double burdens of working mothers. All this made worse by anti-Jewish restrictions imposed by the Tsarist regime. Thousands of Jews were migrating to America, some to Argentina. Peretz dedicated himself to saving Polish Jewry, and he did just that to the best of his ability until his death in 1915. His Ode to Brotherhood proclaimed Jews part of the family of nations and said that they should not settle for less. By the 1890s, there was broad consensus among Jews about the need for fundamental political change. In 1897, the same year that Herzl organized the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Jewish socialists in Vilna founded the Jewish Socialist Bund, and Abe Kahan founded the Socialist Daily, the Yiddish Forwards, here in New York. Peretz was attracted to socialism in that context, but actually, he was one of the very first to identify its dangers. "My heart is with you," he wrote to the radicals, "and yet I fear you. I fear the oppressed who are victorious, lest they turn into oppressors." In a 1905 essay called Hope and Fear, he warned that once socialists prevailed as victors, they would sin against the human spirit, turn into bureaucrats, stifle creativity and individual initiative. "True, bodies will be well fed," he wrote, "but spirits will go hungry." And as it turned out, the bodies weren't so well fed either. So with revolution still in its cradle, Peretz foresaw all its dangers, and the dangers of regimentation, the casualties of enforced egalitarianism, and he warned against them. Now, Montreal educators named their school after Peretz because he opposed all forms of assimilation. He was a powerful cultural leader, and they thought that if school children sang of brotherhood in Yiddish, they would remain Jewish in his spirit. That socialist school could not have encouraged intermarriage, but the doctor proved to be half right. Cultural Jewishness was not enough to prevent intermarriage. By the 1960s, the 3 Montreal Jewish day schools that ranged from communist to socialist had either closed or completely changed their orientation. So Jewish socialism died there of natural causes because it was unsustainable. Now, much more radical than Peretz were the younger Jewish converts to socialism, like Shloime Zanvil Rappaport, better known by his pseudonym Shin Onski as the author of the Dibbuk, the greatest play in the Yiddish repertoire. I call Onski a convert because though his adoption of socialism did not require formal baptism, it inspired transformation that was more extreme than conversion to Christianity. At age 17, he moved away from Judaism and became involved with the Russian socialist movement. He tried radicalizing yeshiva students, but when that was too slow, he went to work in the salt mines, where he educated Russian workers and paid what he thought was the intellectual's debt to the Russian folk. His activities and writings drew the attention of the Tsarist police, and to escape them, he moved to Paris and became prominent in émigré socialist circles. All this time, he went by a Russian name and functioned as a member of the revolutionary vanguard. Onski was among the most dedicated Russian Jewish youth that took up the revolutionary cause. And may I say, their bravery stands in stark contrast to the protected protest of today's college students. Onski's teeth rotted in the salt mines. He was arrested, imprisoned. He justified leaving the narrower Jewish sphere in order to reform Russia for all its citizens. But in 1901, when he was 38 years old, he discovered the works of Peretz and realized that he had given up too much of himself, that he could pursue his work as a Jewish socialist, writing in Yiddish and trying to promote socialism for and among Jews. Why convert when you can merge the two? Onski wrote the Yiddish anthem of the Jewish Socialist Bund. I won't sing it. Brothers and sisters in struggle and toil, all ye who are scattered far and wide, come join together, the flag is unfurled, it waves in anger, red with blood. Swear an oath on life and death, we swear endless loyalty to the Bund. And then the chorus says, we swear, we swear. Now, the belligerence of this oath shows how militant the revolutionary movement had grown in the decade since Peretz's sweet ode to brotherhood. But there was a problem. Whereas Jewish socialists fought for proletarian brotherhood, much of the proletariat preferred attacking the Jews. The first Russian revolutionary uprising of 1905 was accompanied by anti-Jewish pogroms that some of its leaders accepted as collateral damage of mobilization. Revolutionaries thought that the energy of the mobs ravaging Jewish homes and looting Jewish stores could be useful to the class struggle. What did Jews matter compared to the goal of world revolution? Onski realized that there was a choice, after all, between protecting the Jewish people and pursuing the universal ideal of world revolution. That same choice, in one form or another, has confronted every Jewish social justice warrior since the first Jew, Abraham, argued with God on behalf of the inhabitants of Sodom. So Onski's final break with the revolutionary movement came in 1917. After the overthrow of the Tsar, he was appointed as a delegate to the Constitutional Assembly that set out to rule Russia democratically. But the Bolsheviks shut down the assembly and did what socialism so often tends to do. It established single-party rule. Onski fled, this time not from the Tsar, but from the revolution, and found refuge among the Jews in Warsaw and Vilna that were not under Soviet rule. He threw himself into Jewish relief effort, and in 1920 he wrote the new song that was markedly different from the earlier socialist oath. It goes like this: for thousands of years our thorn bush burns and is not consumed. From exile to exile, through tears and defeats at Gentile hands, we have fled without arms, without protection or hope or land. Powerful rulers slaughtered us and cried, filthy neighbors, get out of our way. And suddenly, a marvelous message arrives from mighty lands. Israel, awaken, return to your tents. Your territory is back in your hands. Throughout the Jewish exile, banners wave, trumpets sound, the chains of exile snap. A biblical people revives. Jews gather, chalutzim come to forge again the golden Jewish chain. Now, this is Onski, right? The marvelous message he is referring to that he hears calling Israel to awake and return to its land was, of course, the Balfour Declaration. And the image of Jewish revival was inspired by Zev Jabotinsky's formation of the Jewish Legion. Onski hailed the efforts of Jewish self-defense and the Zionist pioneers who were cultivating the soil of the land of Israel. Putting Jewish survival at the front of his concerns, he admitted the failure of socialist theory to account for anti-Jewish violence and the failure of socialist practice to prevent it. When socialism hardened into Bolshevik communism, he knew that the movement to which he had dedicated his life had betrayed its ideal. And I think his experiences, you see, anticipated the fate of the Jews who then fell under Soviet rule. Yet oddly enough, despite the fact that Zionism and socialism were at the two extremes of the Jewish political spectrum, their fusion seemed to work in the land of Israel. The labor Zionist leader Nachman Sirkin spoke for many when he claimed that socialism could not live up to its peaceful aims unless it allowed the Jews their homeland, and that the Jewish homeland could not live up to its potential unless it was egalitarian. But more important than the theorists were the pioneers who built the first kibbutz, Degania, in 1910, and 250 more by 1950. These small egalitarian communities proved their worth in the swamps they drained, the fields they cultivated, the self-governing practices they followed, and the defense forces they developed for themselves and the nation. The infrastructure of a modern Jewish state, under impossibly difficult condition, was unquestionably made easier by the collectivist ethos based on socialist principles. And kibbutzim were only part of Israel's socialist project. In 1920, David Ben-Gurion created the Histadrut, a trade union of Jewish workers. To avoid the rivalry that would have arisen among vying unions of competing political parties, he tried to make this a nonpartisan organization, quote, a united federation of all the workers and laborers of Palestine who live by the sweat of their brows without exploiting the toil of others. The original 4,000 some odd members of the Histadrut eventually grew into 3/4 of the Jewish workforce of the country. So why could labor Zionism work better in Israel than Jewish socialism elsewhere? The answer lies, I think, in the relation of adjective to noun, labor Zionism versus Jewish socialism. The Jews pioneering the Jewish homeland along socialist principles were conducting an experiment in Jewish civilization, one of many such socio-political experiments in the history of the Jewish people. Zionism was a movement of national self-emancipation, and socialism helped temporarily to achieve some of its ends. The kibbutzim were voluntary associations, and when the social pressures of egalitarianism suppressed too much individualism, just as Peretz had foretold, their members were free to leave. If the majority wanted stronger family units, more creative self-expression, greater mobility, or private property, they changed the rules of self-governance, adapting or discarding aspects of collectivism as required. And similarly, on a national level, the collective ethos was important in bringing the country together with one national language and one central government. In its early stages, the Jewish community of Palestine had to ask its members to sacrifice some of their personal ambitions and freedoms to work together for the common good. The Workers' Party, Mapai, ruled a center-left coalition for Israel's first 2 decades. But once the nation had proven its staying power, voters recognized the proven advantages of free markets and free enterprise, and the stifling costs of an overweening bureaucracy. Kibbutzim began to function as capitalist units. Once Israel liberated its economy and gained some security in the region, it became what it is today, a startup nation. I think that nowhere else has socialism been tried so freely, and therefore nowhere else have its limitations been so honestly exposed. This is one of the many reasons why committed socialists have soured, rejected the country that they once professed to admire. Which brings us back to Brüder, brotherhood, the promise that class solidarity would suppress ethnic conflict and include the Jews. Labor Zionism expected not just to shape the state of Israel, but also to normalize its international status. With that expectation, Israel's Workers' Party, which later evolved into the Labor Party, joined the Socialist International. Representing Israel for much of that time was Shimon Peres, the only person to serve as both Israel's prime minister and later its president. And he was also a vice president of the Socialist International. In 1999, the Socialist International made Peres honorary president for the same reason that he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, for his commitment to a peaceful future for both Israelis and Palestinians. His obituary on the Socialist International website praises his conviction that peace for Israel and Palestine would be achieved within his lifetime, but deeply regrets that so little recent progress has been made in this regard. Whereas Israelis honored Peres for his important role early on in securing Israel's defensive capability, the Socialist International honored him for the Oslo Accords that sacrificed Israel's security. The years of his honorary chairmanship, 1999 to 2003, coincided with the peak years of the Second Intifada, almost as if the International were rewarding him for putting his country at risk. The Socialist International has been turning steadily against Israel until last year it called on all governments to join in boycott, divestment, and sanctions against the Israeli occupation. It appealed for a total embargo on all forms of military trade and cooperation with Israel, and charged Israel with apartheid against the Palestinian people, essentially joining the Arab war against the Jewish state. This left Israel's Labor Party with no choice but to finally suspend its membership in the organization. And in the Wall Street Journal, Elliot Kaufman, who spoke here last year, asked, "What took it so long?" But we know the answer. If it was hard to acknowledge that socialism brought more harm than good to a functioning democracy, it was even harder to give up the fantasy of an international brotherhood that welcomed the Jews. So this autopsy is overdue. The Jewish-socialist merger failed on all counts because of socialism's inherent deficiencies, because the merger was unsustainable in a diaspora climate of free choice, and inadequate in a sovereign Jewish state, and because socialist internationalism embraced and inflamed anti-Jewish politics, including, as we now see all around us, among the Jews themselves. The German socialist August Bebel tried to dismiss anti-Semitism as the socialism of fools, but instead, socialism turned out to be the anti-Semitism of the enlightened. So, as a good socialist, Bernie Sanders did not try to merge it with Judaism. He gave up Judaism, and like many Jewish converts of the past, he turned against it with a vengeance. He is the only Democratic presidential candidate running as a socialist, the only born Jew, and the one endorsed by Israel's strongest enemies in Congress. This also makes him the natural godfather of today's fake Jewish socialists who follow the lead of those claiming to be victims of Israel and join their vicious crusade against its defenders, when instead they could be protecting America and Israel against our common enemies. So as we see, this is not an anomaly. It is the logical outcome of an ideology whose claim to rational authority, political progress, and moral superiority can never accept the Jews that stood at Sinai. Jews are the God-inspired people that forges its golden chain against all ideological alternatives. At first, we did not understand that one of the most threatening of those ideologies was socialism. But now we know, and we know why, so it is time to spread the word. Thank you.